at media coverage of Indian country and the way that journalists write about Indigenous issues in the United States. We'll be talking to Jenny Monet, a journalist who founded the email newsletter Indigenously. Jenny is an enrolled member of the Laguna Pueblo Nation who's been covering Indian country for more than 20 years. Jenny, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me on your show and congrats on it.
Thank you. So this episode is about Indian country. So I guess the first question I'll ask you is, what exactly is Indian country?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's a great entry point because I think when people hear the term Indian country, they have an idea, but they're not really sure. And the answer is that there's actually two ways to respond to that question. One is that it actually is a legal term of art. Indian country is used in our treaties and what we would describe as our modern day treaties, a lot of federal law and policies. And you can always tell the difference of when it's being used in the most formal federal sense, in that the I is capitalized and the C is lowercase. And so when you see that referenced as Indian country, it's often in quotations, and it's meant to indicate that it's a legal term of art to indicate the federal lands of which comprise of roughly 324, I believe is the approximate number of Indian reservations, tribal trust lands across the United States, and the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And that includes 229 in Alaska, which only has one reservation in the state, but that little piece of reservation land would be considered Indian country based on the tribal trust relationship that tribes have as sovereigns to sovereigns with the federal government. Now, on a broader scale, in generalization, Indian country, big I, big C, what you see oftentimes used in headlines or in news articles that are speaking generally about Indian country in terms of tribal affairs, politics, other matters such as the coronavirus, when we're using it in a more broad sense and not speaking specifically to any particular reservation, say urban Indian affairs, that would be used as a broader scope of Indian country. And
so I guess first talking about the more narrow definition, the sort of legal term of art. This is a legal term that the federal government uses to classify essentially federal land that is controlled by tribes on reservations, or that there's some agreement between Indian tribes and the federal government regarding this land?
Yeah, I think the best way to approach the legal term of art question is to kind of roll back the view a little bit and look at the structure that we have as our family of governments in the United States. So I think most people are aware that we have federal governments and we have state governments, and our news feeds have almost entirely circulated around all of those structures of those two governments. Certainly within states, we unpack that for municipalities and villages and townships. Well, what almost always has gotten ignored and forgotten about is the third tier of government, the third sovereign, and that's tribal. And the most immediate example I can give to you of that is the CARES Act that we saw unravel from the coronavirus in March through May. If you look at that story, particularly of the allocations that were set aside for the federal government and the states, Indian country was completely forgotten about. We had to actually, there was a lot of lobbying at the last minute to make sure that tribes were written in for the $8 billion CARES Act that eventually was set aside for tribal governments. But I mean, we were not written in the first draft. And that's pretty common when you look at a host of laws and policies, say, for instance, labor laws. So often some of the labor laws that play out in cities and county governments, there's a big question mark about whether or not they apply, say, for instance, at tribal casinos that operate and employ both native and non-native employees. And those kind of issues get raised in courts and in complaints a lot. And so, I think that that's the easiest example I can give to you, is that the CARES Act actually had to be fought to get that same kind of parity, when in fact tribal governments are on the same equal type of playing field when it comes to being seen as sovereigns. The only difference is that the trust relationship between tribes and the federal government don't typically involve the United States, or excuse me, states, individual states that they're in. So there are 574 federally recognized tribes spread across 35 states in the United States. And in those individual states, the states aren't overseeing tribal matters with the same kind of respect of the sovereign to sovereign relationship that tribes have with the federal government. And that's because of the treaties. That's because of the type of non-intercourse act that was established in the colonization of this country, one of the first laws that was established in the United States. We didn't do that with states, right? And nothing really transpired in the development of the United States upon expansion. That relationship was solidified as sovereigns, and the whole basis of federal Indian law is based on that kind of trust relation, what we call the trust relationship with the federal government.
And so the Indian tribes, these sovereign nations that have agreements specifically with the federal government. So it's not the case that Indian reservations fall within state law, even if they are located, like physically located within these states, they are not subject to the state law?
That's mostly correct. I mean, and I think that one thing important to understand that trust relationship is that tribes still are good neighbors in the states that they're in. So for instance, gaming has really solidified that kind of neighborly relationship with tribes. In New Mexico, where I'm from, where I'm a tribal citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico, when the Sandia Pueblo became the first state, or the first tribe in the state to build its casino, it was really kind of seen as a model for other tribes in the region and how it was going to engage with the state of New Mexico with regard to its gaming compacts, how taxes were going to be rolled out and shared. What was that kind of marriage going to be to have the state's first major big casino, which is, if you've been to Albuquerque, New Mexico, you know that the Sandia Pueblo is just on the outskirts of Albuquerque. And so to have, for the first time, entertainment, gaming coming into a community, how is that going to impact the fabric of the community, the social life, and all of the other aspects that come with it, right? Policing and community engagement and other matters. And so the tribes really became good stewards in that. And to this day, New Mexico has one of the most healthiest relationships as a state with its tribal governments in terms of understanding its sovereignty, respecting that sovereignty. And with that has come, understanding the steps of communicating with tribes, receiving their consent whenever tribal lands are involved, tribal rights are involved. And oftentimes in some of the more marginalized states, like I'm thinking in the Dakotas, where we're seeing the Dakota Access Pipeline development play out, all too often consent is just completely ignored. And some would argue deliberately so.
So again, just kind of in trying to understand the relationship that Indian nations have with the different governments, I think that, Indian reservations are often associated with gaming and gambling because they are not subject to the state laws. It's sort of seen as an exception. But beyond that, I feel that people generally think of Indian reservations as being closer to municipalities, where they have like exceptions from some state laws, but otherwise they're still like part of that state. But do you think it's more accurate to look at it as though these are almost individual states of their own?
I think that tribes are so diverse that what you've just described Peter, could be described to some tribes. And I'm thinking in that kind of respect, more or less what we've seen in the more colonized tribes, if you will, which are what we see as the 5 tribes in what is today Oklahoma. And I put them in that frame of reference in quotations, colonized, because they have always been called the 5 civilized tribes for a reason, because they have latched on to a lot of colonizing ideals, including how they ran their governments. I mean, this is predating Oklahoma statehood in the late, in the 1800s. And so even today, you see those tribes, those 5 tribes in Oklahoma, which really are centered around the historic McGirt decision, which we saw last year, which restored treaty rights to the tribes. Those governments have consistently operated on a more advanced level that I think mimic municipalities and state governments more than anything, in terms of the structures of how their executive branch, how their branches of government fall in terms of 3 branches. I'm thinking of the Cherokee Nation. They have an executive, judicial, and legislative branch that functions quite well and has been in effect for longer than a century. And so they are representing of a more advanced form of government. And then if you were to look at maybe the polar opposite end of that, I'm thinking Alaska, where these are villages that fall under a very drastically different set of colonial origins in terms of how their governments were formed and structured. Before the Supreme Court this year is a case that will look at how that colonization came to be under these very bizarre constructed corporations called Alaska Native corporations, basically 12 regional, what are called arms of these governments, these tribal governments, that basically kind of dictate a lot of big issues like healthcare and economic development for the tribe. But at the end of the day, the tribes are still, these villagers are operating in quasi sovereigns. And so it's this weird in between that if you were to put them alongside, say, that like a government like the Cherokee Nation, they would be vastly different. And so I think that when you look at the fact that Indian country is not this monolith, that there's not this one homogenous kind of way of how it functions. For instance, not all tribes have casinos, less than half do. And even among those that do operate casinos, there's a percentage of them that are situated far away from any kind of populated city or community to which, their revenues, just because you're a tribal casino running tribe, that doesn't mean that you're making a lot of money off of it all the time. There are certainly those that are very wealthy, but I mean, there's just a lot of dynamics that go in. And I think that once people really understand the geographic diversity of Indian country, that becomes very clear.
And obviously, we talked a little bit about the gaming, the casinos, and there is sort of that, that stereotype, I think, of those tribes that do, almost seem to use the lack of state law as a loophole to allow developers to build casinos and then, get a lot of revenue from that and do become very wealthy. But obviously, it's not just the case that, sovereign Indian tribes or nations are allowed to build casinos or sell cigarettes. These things that are seen as almost loopholes from state law. There are lots of other, I guess, regulations and laws that they can have related to their relationship with the federal government. So what would be other, I guess, laws or regulations that I feel like I'm not really explaining it well, but things like hunting rights, water rights, mineral rights. Like, what does it mean to be a sovereign nation and not just, a private community that is part of a state? What are these rights that are so important for these sovereign nations to preserve?
Well, I think if you look back before, the late 60s, early 70s, right? Sovereignty was a concept that was not what we see it and know of it today as this self-empowering tool for Native nations to build themselves off of. It was very much a paternalistic society. Government was largely making the rules up, and might I add, making them up as they go along. And it was an abusive record to at once try to even eliminate tribes from the 40s through the 60s in an era known as the Termination Era. And so what we saw under Nixon more than anything was a resurgence of tribes, a rebirth of a lot of tribal governments that had attempted to be dissolved by the federal government. And from that, there has been this building from the 1970s up until present day of tribes themselves in the modern sense, not only recognizing and understanding their own sovereign powers, but building upon it decade after decade. And what we've seen in the last 10 years, I would say, and President Obama is a big part of this, is his embrace of sovereignty in all of its concepts of nation to nation building. I mean, what we're talking about when we're talking about sovereignty today is that it is nation building, not unlike what we see in any type of other country around the world, particularly developing nations, which one would argue is what Indian country represents. And one could argue is what gaming represents in and of itself. It's an engine intended for economic development in communities that are already stymied by policies that keep tribes from taxing running themselves like any other kind of municipality in terms of tax base, revenue base. Tribes are hindered from that by policies that have been enforced by the federal government in large part to oppress tribes. And so when gaming came along, and I find this really interesting, there's scholarship that's rising to really critically look at gaming, and that prior to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1989, there was actually a lot more freedom for tribes to benefit from their own gaming operations that were operating unregulated at the time. I'm thinking of old bingo operations like in California, and there's one in Maine in the Penobscot Nation that was doing very well. And once regulations started coming in, it was actually seen as a rollback, as a restriction on the kind of freedom that tribes were able to have. And that just is one more example of the federal government kind of having their grip on tribal affairs at every turn. And another example of that, a long legacy of that, has been natural resource extraction. Another way, one of the few ways that tribes have been able to actually generate wealth on their historic treaty lands by what lies beneath it, right? So where I come from, Laguna Pueblo, at one time in the 50s and 60s, we were home to literally the largest open pit uranium mine in the world, not just in America, but in the world, known as the Jack Pile Mine. And at the time, it was seen as very controversial because there were other Pueblo communities nearby who were vehemently against it. There was deep concern about what the environmental impact would be, not only the impact on our culture and our tradition. And, Laguna ended up restoring the land as close to its original foundation, but it took a long time to do that, and there was a lot of hardship in between that. And so, these stories of economic development are very much a part of the sovereign timeline of Indian country itself, understanding where its strengths and its weaknesses lie. And I think that what's fascinating right now when we're looking at, say, for instance, a new era of Deb Haaland entering the fray, in leading the Department of Interior, the main agency that has been so abusive to Indian country. I just think that there's real hope and promise to kind of rethink things in a way that truly sees upon the sovereignty of tribes in terms of generating their own economic interest and their own sovereign destinies.
Because I think that right now it seems like tribal sovereignty is primarily thought of or used as an exception to sort of federal or especially state regulations and laws, as opposed to being seen as sort of its own affirmative thing. It's not so much that tribes are setting their own laws and actually creating their own ways of life, so much as it's they are able to rely on sovereign legal concepts to be exempted from other laws. And then, of course, sometimes even that is not respected. I think there is not a general kind of understanding, including in the media, that tribes are sovereign entities that do have the right to determine whether or not, say, a pipeline should go through their land.
Well, there's definitely anti-Indigenous sentiment. I mean, it's alive and well. You can read several court briefs. I'm thinking Brackeen is among the leading one that we're still waiting for a ruling to come down in the U.S. Supreme Court. But the Brackeen case is a case that centers around the Indian Child Welfare Act. And what the Indian Child Welfare Act is it's a federal law that is intended to keep Native American children within Native American households as opposed to being adopted out to non-Native families. And that was in response to what otherwise was an organized effort in the 60s, in the 50s and the 60s, at the time when the federal government was terminating tribes, dismantling tribes. They were also systematically working in new ways to take away their children. When boarding schools were already in the mix, well, they found another way to do that through these organized adoptions. And there's these fantastic, and I say fantastic in the sense that they've been archived, these incredible hearings that have been archived from the I think they were the early 70s, right on the eve that the Indian Child Welfare Act is being considered and enacted. And they're crushing and they're heartbreaking because they're just one more story in the colonial American timeline of child separation, and child separation happening from within Indigenous communities and families. And so, the point I was making around that is that we're now before the Supreme Court with this, what could be another landmark decision facing Indian country that is looking at whether or not to overturn that act. Essentially, it questions whether or not Native Americans are a race, basically what you addressed earlier, Peter, whether they're a race or whether they're these political identities that have a sovereignty with a sovereign relationship with the federal government. And that in of itself is also a very complicated and disruptive conversation to have. But it's one that, and it's because of its roots in colonialism, right? I mean, the way that Native identity is parceled out is not unlike, looking at pedigrees of dogs and horses. It's the most complicated and race-based and, just dripping in all kinds of white supremacist roots of idealism. But unfortunately, it is what has structured the relationship that Native nations have with the federal government based on the frame of reference, the historical frame of reference that we're working under. And so I'm not sure that I totally answered your question, but I know that what you were getting at was actually where I was kind of seeing some kind of cross-reference to.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that case and that idea of whether Indigenous nations have the right to control where Indigenous children get adopted to. Is it if they're just a race, then they might not have that kind of legal authority. But if you recognize that they are sovereign entities, then they should have the right to make those kinds of laws and to have those laws be made by the federal government that would apply to them.
Yeah, so there's this critical turning point that happens in the historical timeline. And I know I reference history a lot here. I'm shifting from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Well, now I'm going to go back to 1934. And that was the year of the what's known as the Indian New Deal. And the Indian Commissioner at the time came up with this plan to basically shift the whole tables on how the federal government was working with Indian country. It fell on the heels of an era that of forced removal of tribes, of assimilation attempts on their identities, sending them through boarding schools. And so we're coming off of like some of the bloodiest, but also the harshest years the federal government had treated to tribes from like, the 1880s all the way up until the 1930s. And the Indian New Deal was meant to reverse a lot of that in terms of the allotments of lands, the erasure of native culture. And so the Indian New Deal comes in and works to empower and embolden tribes through creating tribal governments, right? Trying to formalize tribal governments through constitutions. And as part of these constitutions and to kind of play into the sovereign relationship that Native nations would have with the federal government, they implemented and formalized for the first time what's known as blood quantum. And I've just come off of doing some really deep research about this because there was a question of whether or not all tribes bought into blood quantum at the time or not. And it's still pretty vague. There's a lot of gaps in the archival timeline. But one thing is pretty clear is that tribes as sovereign nations at that time in 1934 had a choice to either not be a blood quantum tribe, which means not deduce themselves to pedigree calculus systems and just keep, moving on as kinship societies. But that would mean that they are not part of the entitled system and recognized by the federal government, meaning that any programs that any treaty protected programs that should come out that are managed and overseen by the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, any type of monies that get doled out, and any type of policies that are shifted, if they don't recognize your tribal citizenry within this frame of reference of 50% of at least blood, Indian blood or more, then you weren't considered a native, you weren't considered a tribe. And, you can go on and keep doing what you'd like, but in the eyes of the federal government, there was this very colonial structure of eugenics, right? This code of eugenics that was playing out.
So I want to stop you there and sort of clarify what exactly was the difference between seeing tribal membership as sort of a kinship society versus moving to a sort of vision of tribal membership that was based in blood quantum, because wouldn't a kinship society also be based on lineage and pedigree?
Not necessarily. I mean, tribal citizen or native nations were always based on kinship societies, based on who were in their family circles, and there just wasn't a lot of division. There wasn't a lot of separation. I mean, what happens and why we started seeing blood equations coming in is very much a European concept, number one. The Europeans brought it here. They mostly implemented it first with their slaves, and then they did not apply it equally to Native Americans, interestingly enough. If you look at the one drop rule is very much a way to keep people Black and make that population bigger, whereas in Indian country, for Native people, the goal there is to reduce the size of the Native American population so that the federal government, by their treaty obligations, is not as obligated to that population. So the smaller that they make that population, the better. And we started seeing the first signs of blood quantum in around 1817 and the treaties that were still being signed then. Treaties stopped around 1871. And we started seeing blood quantum get entered into these treaties in terms of land divisions, who got what kind of land, how the power was going to be shifted, to the citizenry in terms of whatever kind of rights are doled out, whether that was in money or any other kinds of services of some kind. And you started seeing that being mentioned, not in all the treaties, but it starts to build, and it builds and becomes a really centralized methodology in 1887 upon what's known as the Daws Allotment Act. And that really was the turning point in terms of looking at this colonial structure, this colonial idea of blood quantum, who is an Indian, right? And fractionating that off as a method to divide up native lands and to shore it up for the rest of the colonizers, plain and simple. And they kept moving those goalposts all the way until 1934, where they implemented a law that said you're either 50% of native ancestry or not, as seen by your tribe. And if you're not in that mix, you're not considered a Native American. And if your tribe doesn't see you as that mix, you're not a Native American. And that kind of set in motion this really emotional issue of mathematics, blood mathematics, that really weren't indigenous at all, but have been adopted by tribes as a matter of survival.
So essentially, beginning in sort of the 1880s, the government started defining tribal membership as being according to blood, and that continued up to the 1930s, at which point the government basically said that we are only going to recognize you as a sovereign tribe if your basis of membership is blood quantum. So if you have another, idea of what constitutes membership in your tribe, then that was not something that federal regulations would consider. And so if you refused to consider the blood quantum, then you were not going to be entitled to any rights. And I think there's a very good comment here from Michelle Alexander, who's been commenting a lot on this broadcast, where they point out that tribal sovereignty should obviously mean that tribes get to decide who belongs to the tribe. It should not be based on what the federal government requires. If you actually respected the sovereignty of each tribal nation, you would respect what they choose to consider tribal membership. But starting in the 1930s, you had the federal government saying that all of the benefits or the rights that would be accorded to indigenous people would depend on whether or not they were at least 50% Indian blood.
Oh, let me clarify. So Michelle's absolutely right. Like, a true sovereign would mean that they are respected to set their own membership guidelines. And that actually is the case today. There was another historic lawsuit that happened in the 1970s called Santa Clara v. Martinez. And that was a landmark suit because it was largely seen as upholding those sovereign rights for a tribe's right to determine its own citizenry. And that has set in motion tribes to reduce that 50% blood quantum if they wanted to a lower degree. Why a tribe would want to do that is because there is actually something known as bleeding out. I mean, you could essentially blood quantum your tribal citizenry out of extinction. There's actual audits that get taken across Indian country that tribes examine on how their generational longevity has to exist. I mean, it's a real issue, and it's one that's fueled by all kinds of emotions. And not every tribe is the same in terms of their how they determine their lineage, and their citizenry. I'll go back to the Cherokee Nation. They are what you would call a lineal descent tribe, which means that they allow anybody who can prove an ancestor on their base roll, which is that complicated Daws roll that I was telling you about, that fractionated all the people and the land back in 1887. That is the base roll for the Cherokee Nation. My tribe, for instance, we have a 1/4 base roll based on the matrilineal line of our mothers. We're a matrilineal society, and for a long time we were at 1/4, and now we were at half, and now we're at 1/4. And there's always been consternation for people to even lower it from 1/4 now to 1/8, which would have allowed my nephew to be a tribal citizen, of which he's not. And so these are the real dynamics that I think a lot of people don't realize and recognize when we start talking about who is a Native American today, who is a tribal citizen. I'll go back to referencing my nephew. I mean, he's very much Native. He grew up knowing his Native songs and dances, and yet he is not a tribal citizen of the Pueblo that his mother belongs to. And so these, and there's just a lot of hardship that comes with, I think, as Native nations mature and they are equally embracing their sovereignty. On the other side of that coin, there's these real kind of confronting issues that are pressuring tribes to really ask big questions about how they will manage their existence, moving on into the future. And I'll just say, and I'll wrap this part up, but the reason why a tribe wouldn't want, like my tribe wouldn't want to reduce the blood quantum is because it's somewhat based off of fear. There's this notion that, there's so limited resources to go around for poor tribal communities, that mean that there are more people that would try to come in to gather whatever resources are there. And I'm not saying that that's even a universal reason, but, for instance, the Cherokees, they represent one of the largest tribes in the United States based on that lineal descendancy. And there's a lot of consternation with that.
And so I just want to clarify that court case that essentially reaffirmed tribal sovereignty. Did that give tribes the right to decrease the amount of blood quantum necessary for enrollment while preserving, like they still had to define it in terms of blood quantum, or did that allow them to define it any way they wanted, such as any lineal descendant?
Any way they wanted to, as long as they have a tribal citizenry role that they can communicate that to the federal government for services. Whenever the DOI, BIA want to dole out how much housing money to give, how much Indian Health Service money to allocate, right? These are the equations that come into mind.
Yeah, and I mean, what you were talking about before, this sort of concern on the one hand about, you don't want to let in sort of too many people, and you also don't want to exclude people who clearly are part of the tribal community. I think that there is sometimes a stereotype. I don't know if it's as common in the US, just because I honestly don't think anyone thinks about it, but I'm really interested in like Canada, because I feel like Canada is a country where like people seem to actually know that Indigenous sovereignty is a thing, and it's something that is discussed in politics. And like the Canadian government still exploits and oppresses Indigenous people, but at least it's something that people know about. Whereas here, I feel like people just honestly don't even think about it. But to the extent that people do, consider the rights that sovereign tribes are afforded, I think there is sometimes this concern or this stereotype that, people will claim allegiance or membership in a tribe, even if they don't have any connection to it, just because the tribe is going to make lots of money off of casino revenues. right? Like, if anyone can join, then everyone is just going to join to get that benefit.
Oh, yeah, you've really just struck right at the thorniest issue of why this identity, this issue of identity is so emotional for a lot of people. And in fact, if you read the latest newsletter that we just put out for Indigenously, we call it Policing Indigeneity because it has become such an unavoidable issue in the last 2 months. And speaking to our neighbors to the north in Canada, there was one explosive case that unraveled around an acclaimed filmmaker who was outed by a bunch of Indigenous journalists who was falsely claiming Indigenous ancestry and was capitalizing it off of a really big way. She had won films. In this instance, she had used Standing Rock as her platform to win awards that are akin to our Academy Awards here in the United States. She was moving forward with major television productions. The sad part about that, her co-creation is this TV series called Trickster. And while the CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, which is executive producer of the program, isn't saying that her false claims to Indigenous ancestry were the reasons why that show Trickster got pulled. Nevertheless, this one show, which is believed to be maybe the only series in the world, definitely in North America, that features an all-Native cast and crew mostly, it got canceled. And as I wrote in my newsletter, when you realize that kind of representation, authentic Indigenous representation, is yanked from you because of an imposter, that empties you. There's a real violation that has been felt any time that this has happened, and it's not new. Indigenous imposter syndrome is like a real thing, and it's been going on for longer than a century. And we're starting to see a new wave of it post Standing Rock. Certainly in this space of social media, it's really hard to, if you're not Indigenous, to zero in on the nuances of what to look for. And I think that as people grow more hungry to yearn to learn more about the Indigenous narrative, to understand it, there are many traps to fall into in terms of not knowing who to trust, not knowing what information is valid or invalid, because the fakery is so rampant. And it's so rampant because for a number of reasons. It's bizarre that a lot of people just want to be Native American. Case in point, the U.S. Census has two figures that it projects for Native American identity. They call it American Indian Alaska Native identity. And one is a major inflated figure. In the 2018-19 last count, it projected something like 6.2 million Americans identify as American Indian Alaska Native with other races. And then when you look at American Indian Alaska Native alone, which is just that identity, that number is almost cut in half at 2.6 million. And it's just remarkable because when you actually look at the tribal citizenry figures collectively from all the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, they more or less match that smaller figure at around 2.5 million tribal citizens. So what that tells you is that half of the people in the U.S. Census that identify as Native American in that larger figure don't have citizenship status to a tribe. That doesn't mean that they're all fakes. They could be people like my nephew, but they also could be people like Michelle Latimer, that filmmaker that we saw in Canada that was, exploiting false claims to Indigenous ancestry. It's complicated.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly see instances of that sort of, racial fakery as well in the U.S. People claiming, African American or Latinx, ethnicity, even when they are just white. But one thing that I think is interesting about indigenous identity is the fact that it's not just, an ethnicity. Like, it is a political status. So it would seem to be difficult to fake, since, there is a list of enrolled members of indigenous tribes. So if you claim it, how, can't they check the list?
Well, the problem is, particularly here in the United States, there isn't really any real protections or, let's say, a punishment for somebody for faking their ethnicity. Where we've seen indigenous fakery breed mostly is in academia. So one key case was Ward Churchill, who for the longest time was making claims of being Native American, riding off of, scholarships, grants, tenureships, based on having this kind of indigenous identity, and at the same time getting books published under that identity as some kind of expert voice in that space. And I think Ward is a good example to showcase how difficult it is to challenge someone's identity, because there was a real push by some real influential Native activists and advocates. Suzanne Schoen Harjo was one of them. My colleague Jody Rave Spotted Bear was another. And these are hard fights to wage. They stir a lot of hard feelings. The backlash is met with a lot of harshness. And in the end, what ended up leading to Churchill's demise wasn't identity claims, but rather claims of plagiarism over somebody else's native work, which actually, once it intersected with everything else, it ended his tenure as a professor. But, if we also look at Elizabeth Warren, there was all of this Boston Globe investigation, and, the Cherokee Nation got involved. And I think it really did not come to anything until the Cherokee Nation, as an official voice, came out and said, no, she's not on our rolls. We don't recognize her. It was only then that you really started to see Elizabeth Warren roll back a lot of her most vocal statements of, what I always love, what fakes always say is that, well, I know who I am, and you can't tell me anything different. And I just think that, Native people are really good at sussing out who's legit and who's not. But it's also, as I wrote in my newsletter, they're just almost unwinnable battles to fight. And that's what's sad, because it keeps happening.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm surprised that there are so many people faking indigenous identity in the United States, because I feel like indigenous people are so exploited that there isn't really any upside.
Well, what I wrote the other day, you steal our land, you steal our kids, you steal our languages, and then you come and take our identities, right? And that's basically, it's these last nail in the coffin of the colonization. And we do have, unlike Canada, we actually have a law here in the United States that it prohibits it's called the Native American Arts and Crafts Act, as opposed to the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act. But it's an Arts and Crafts Act, and you have to prove your tribal citizenry if you are going to market any wares as Native American. The problem is that it's a very limited space as to what constitutes arts and crafts. So does that include literature? Does that include films? Does that include journalism even? And the answer to those latter questions are no. It's really there is that protection, and there's an argument in Canada actually to adopt that and to expand that in the aftermath of the Michelle Latimer filmmaker incident, to set real penalty at this. And it's just created it's an age old debate, and it's not the last time we're going to hear it, unfortunately.
And I still feel like, at least in the U.S., there is a sense of, people claim like Native American identity, because there's a general sense of Native American as being this kind of all-encompassing identity, as opposed to identifying people by membership in specific tribes or nations. Do you feel like that is changing? Has it changed in the 2 decades you've been doing this journalism?
No, sadly, no. I think it's one of those. It's one of those issues that everyone knows they have to deal with. It's kind of like climate change, right? Like, we know that if we don't start changing our ways, that there's going to be gloomier days. And maybe we'll be gone and we won't see that. Maybe we'll be on our way out, but our children and our grandchildren are going to have to contend with these forecasted problems that we know are in the path and in the future, but it's hard to wrap our minds around them, to make them an immediate problem for us to solve, right? And that I look at in the very same way as what quantum is, and what this lineage problem is, and identity issues. And I think that as our Native nations embrace their sovereignty, because we're starting to see that. We're starting to see nation building growing at a really lovely, remarkable pace. I think that there is going to be a real era where we're going to start embracing this issue. And I think that we're starting to see the really nascent stages of that. And I think that these 2 Supreme Court cases that I was telling you about, the one about the Alaska Native corporations, which questions what constitutes an Indian tribe, and the other, the Brackeen case about the Indian Child Welfare Act, about who is an Indian, right? Those are 2 centralized questions in these very big, important lawsuits. I think that is what is going to bring these issues front and center, my predictions.
So I guess talking about, journalists, especially non-native journalists, what would be some advice you would give them when writing about issues that touch on Indian country or indigenous issues? Like, for instance, should people never say Native American or Indian and always specify the specific tribe?
Yeah, we have on Indigenously's Instagram, we have some allyship tips on how, like, some of these more frequently asked questions about how to approach Indian country as someone new and feeling their way around. And there's a lot of different ways to talk about Native peoples. I've just said Native peoples. You could also use Indigenous peoples, Native Americans. The term Indian is really used more in treaty language. That is really what, as I said, the term Indian country is more of a term of art. Indian is very much a federal term of art. And you don't really hear that getting used in the everyday, certainly not in the journalistic space, unless it's rooted in that kind of federal sense. And then it's always so respectful to address someone among their Native nation identity, of their nationhood. So I'm Laguna Pueblo. If someone wanted to introduce me, they'd say Jenny Monet, tribal citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna, or Laguna Pueblo, as opposed to just saying Native American journalist. And so that's always very respectful. And then there's just a lot of other, I think, Indian Country 101 facts that you can glean if you go to Indigenously. It's indigenous_ly on our Instagram, but there's a little link. There's our little Instagram story that we preserved, which gave the 12 days of Indigenous Peoples Day. And every day we gave a little tip on how to enter our world. One of them talks about our treaties, how to understand us as sovereign nations, looking at us as a citizenry, as a political identity, not races, and all of these kind of fun facts that I think just kind of peel back a very introductory layer of who we are.
And again, I'll ask: have you seen any change or any progress on that in the last 20 years, or not really?
In the last 20 years, in terms of rolling back citizenry, or how people address us?
Yeah, in terms of how people address you, and particularly in how journalists and how media writes about indigenous issues and sovereign nations.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Peter, because I've been covering Indian country for as long as I've been a journalist, which this year marks 21 years. And I got my start covering the Four Corners as a young reporter working for a CBS affiliate. And I have to say that my first real political lesson of understanding Indian country, as opposed to understanding who we were as a res kid growing up, understanding our political identities, came in this very fiery kind of coup-like takeover on the Hickory Apache Nation in just outside of Dulce, New Mexico. And there you had basically a political standoff between two tribal leaders who felt that they both had rightful claim to be the leader of the tribe, and that's where you really started to see a difference in a lot of things for me as a young journalist. I was in my early 20s at the time, maybe 20 years old, and I remember being very confused as to why there weren't any authorities coming in when one of the candidates was armed with his own basically small army of guards, and he took over, literally stormed through the tribal headquarters building and took it over. I mean, that doesn't get more coup-like than that. And I really was, it forced me to understand power, positions, structures of power, and who was responding to the nation at the time, who wasn't, and why. And it was the first time I ever really received clarity in terms of understanding the term internal tribal matter and when the government would intervene. But certainly you had a lot of the municipalities in and around Dulce, New Mexico, off of the Jicarilla, Farmington, Aztec. Those cops who I had relationships with as a young journalist, they said, "Oh no, that's out of our jurisdiction. We never go over there." And so it was just a real lesson for me on a very basic level. And so you asked today, I put that into that context in terms of like where people's awareness is 20 years later. I don't think so, because if that were the case, we would not have seen the surge of stories marveling over the extraordinary lopsided rates of which Native American women and girls are going missing and are murdered. That whole movement known as Missing and Murdered. And that is steeped in jurisdictional crime, right? I mean, we're talking about reservation-based and border town crimes where Native people live. And at these high rates, you're seeing deaths that are unsolved of Native women, or disappearances that, are outpacing others. And so that in and of itself, I think we can bookend those two reporting experience of mine. I've just come off of reporting off of violence in Indian country. And I've not really seen a lot of people understanding that jurisdiction, what Sarah Deer, she's Muskogee Creek and an attorney and a professor, what she has coined the maze of jurisdiction of Indian country.
But is that sort of independent jurisdiction a good thing, that you don't have state police trying to enforce state law in Indian reservations? Like, it seems like the problem with violence in Indian country, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but is the issue that there is violence on reservations among indigenous people that the state police will not investigate? Or is it generally that people are being victimized on reservations by people who are not indigenous, and so the police would have jurisdiction to go after the people doing the violence since they are not indigenous and they're just not doing so?
Yeah, so if you go back to remember that family of governments I was telling you about and the three tiers, federal, state, and tribal, and how the state, you basically need to remove that because the relationship is really between Native nations and the federal government. That certainly is true when we're talking about reservation-based crime. When crimes are committed on the reservation that are considered quote unquote major, murder, sexual assault, burglaries, there's 7 crimes, and murder and serious assault are 2 of them. And when you start to look at those crimes and who responds, if your tribe has a police, basically, if the tribe has a police force, they're responding. But 9 times out of 10, that tribal police force is overmaxed, underpaid, understaffed, and you're basically getting a quality of policing that is so subpar that it might be best that you didn't have anybody respond. And then on top of that, if they are major crimes that are committed that we're talking about, say for instance, that center around the missing and murder movement, those require federal officials to investigate and come onto the reservation. And what has been so chronic in the past is that federal investigators have declined to show up on the reservation because they too are understaffed and overmaxed and underpaid. And so what we saw coming out of the missing and murdered movement over the last 4 or 5 years, a grassroots movement that has its roots back decades, mind you. It's only been in the last 4 to 5 years that it's grown to, under President Trump, actually, in October, he passed 2 laws to once more try to enhance tribal justice programs. But that's been done before, right? Like we saw that even under Obama, where we started to look at where the gaps and cracks in tribal justice were. And I hate to say it, but like I think we're not done yet. There's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of learning still left to do to understand how, when these crimes are committed on reservations, who responds, what are the best ways for tribes themselves to manage their own tribal justice? Because at the end of the day, the sad story of tribal justice is that it was taken away. Tribes had a way to control their own justice until once more, systems of colonization dismantled those rights of justice to tribes. And so largely, there was one hearing I was in, a missing and murdered hearing in December of 2018, I believe, where the Navajo delegate Amber Crotty was speaking to a Senate committee and said, you know what? We're at your mercy. The federal government dismantled our right to manage our own tribal justice. So until you guys are going to give that back to us, we're basically at your mercy. And I think that best sums it up right now.
So do tribes have the, rights to set up justice systems and adjudicate disputes that happen within the tribe?
They do. The problem is they don't always have the money to do that. So there's a few options for tribes. So if you have the funding, you can operate your own tribal courts. I'm not sure what the percentage is of how many tribes actually operate a tribal court. Not all of them do, but they all have the power to do that. Problem comes down to funding. And then once you have your tribal court system running, there are ways to maximize it if you wanted. The Violence Against Women Act would allow, for the first time in the modern sense, for tribes to prosecute non-natives in their court for domestic violence cases that happen on the reservation. That's when I go back to that jurisdictional maze about how tribes can manage their own tribal justice versus whether or not they need to rely on the feds to manage it. The Violence Against Women Act was seen as a very empowering act for Indian country in terms of exercising tribal justice on their own terms, but it costs money. And so you have a very small amount of tribes that are able to do that within their tribal court systems because it costs money to have the right kinds of lawyers and prosecutors and people to follow up on those cases and police officers. So that's very much a part of the nation building. And then there's another extension for tribal justice called the Tribal Law and Order Act, which allows tribes to really embolden their tribal courts to prosecute other cases, other major cases in their tribal courts, mostly native on native. But that when you start looking at native on native crime within tribal community, that might be violent. Tribes could essentially go after those, but they need to fall under this very special dimension called tribal law and order, TLOA. And that also costs money. And so you have very few tribes who are who can afford to pay to play, basically. And those are the kind of conversations that I hear are playing out after covering violence, where I've been covering violence now and crime in Indian country for the last 3 years.
And would it be possible for tribes to go back to, indigenous systems of justice as opposed to just, copying sort of European systems or the systems of the feds or the states? I mean, it feels like, we've obviously seen so much activism among people, criticizing policing practices, criticizing the widespread criminalization of people. So is there a movement to do more like restorative justice or, non-traditional forms of justice within tribes?
Well, you asked very good questions, Peter, because the answer to that is yes. There's actually a really good film. It's called Tribal Justice by Anne Makepeace. I recommend it to a lot of people who are trying to understand in a more human way the tribal justice system, but also looking at where, the sovereignty lies in taking back those justice systems on an indigenous level. The Yurok tribe in Judge Abby Abinanti's court actually is a model program for what's known as tribal restorative justice. And if you look at it, it is really intended to move away from, the structured system of incarceration and punishment, the sentences that we give, that we see in correction society all the time. And on the Yurok Nation, obviously this doesn't apply to all crimes, but the ones that certainly not the major crimes, right? Those are handled on a federal level, but non-federal cases. And I want you to think like, harassment charges, stalking, for instance, these kinds of cases that might be related to historical traumas or, chronic addiction that could be seen as modes of self-medication over treating that historic trauma. There's this notion of looking at these societal problems in a way that frame it in that reference, that these aren't just problems that have evolved from nowhere. And Judge Abby is really coming at this in a restorative way where tradition and culture is the medicine to heal some of these societal problems as opposed to institutionalized incarceration. Because as we've seen, that doesn't really solve problems, and oftentimes our people have been so misunderstood in this way that they should never have been institutionalized in the first place.
And I guess there is a large population of indigenous peoples who do get caught up in the criminal justice system outside of reservations and off of tribal land. So is it fair to say that, indigenous people is a population who are often criminalized along with like African American or Latinx?
Oh, very
People?
much so. Yeah, I mean, I think the most evident of that, in my opinion, is in Alaska. Alaska Native men represent, I think, they're 9% of the population as a total in the state, but in the prisons, they're 15 to 20%. And so
Wow.
when you look at that in terms of, you know, what's what's leading to that, 9 times out of 10, it's unique kinds of cases that are evolving out of these very remote Alaska Native villages where these villages are unpoliced to begin with. And so then you have the way Alaska is set up, because remember, I told you there's only one reservation in Alaska. And so what you have are basically isolated Native communities that are policed only when something bad happens and a state trooper flies in this case, they're state troopers that respond to crimes. They fly in, and there's not a whole lot of balance in terms of the judicial process that plays out. It typically just goes in a pretty uniform method that a crime gets phoned in, police show up, and someone's going through the court process and ending up in jail. And I think the reporting on that hasn't been done yet to the extent where it's deserving. But I have to say that there was a COVID outbreak in the Wasilla prison in Wasilla, Alaska, where the majority of or the largest, most represented population in there were Alaska Natives per capita, and it's just really sad because I know a couple of inmates who've gone in and out of there and did not deserve the extension of their punishment to be in a medium security state prison for as long as they were.
And
they could have benefited from a restorative justice program.
It seems like one of the main sort of issues, that we keep going back to when talking about Indian country is lack of funding. And so what are, I guess, the structural issues that are preventing tribes from being able to fund their governments at like the level of a state or even a city? Is it because they are not allowed to levy taxes on the people who live on tribal land? Is there just a lack of economic opportunity on reservations? And, where does that come from other than, just obviously being a continuation of historical discrimination?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's honoring the treaties. And I know that gets thrown around a lot as a slogan, but it really actually has an economic impact across the board, because when you look at what the treaties represent, they are a prepayment for the lands of which Native peoples negotiated with the colonizers at the birth of this nation, right? I mean, these weren't just agreements that were made for peace. They started out that way, but between somewhere around 1817 and 1871, it was all about the land. And in exchange for that land, there were promises for peace, but also protection, right? Protection which came in the modern sense, for healthcare, education, shelter, housing, economic defense, right? And so when we look at the federal government today, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the TIRA programs that come down, they're not entitlement programs. These are treaty protected programs. And in 2018, we saw the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, once again, 10 years later after its last report, talk one more time about the trail of broken treaties, right? And how this has become the economic stain on the American timeline. And one that can be remedied if they were to fully honor the trust relationship, the trust responsibility that those treaties have obligated the federal government. And I think that that's a really hard thing for non-Indigenous peoples, certainly policymakers, to understand, because I think it's rooted in this very kind of colonial view that these lands, these treaties, they were something that happened far, far in the past, that these somehow expired. These agreements were somehow expired. There's this historic court case, Supreme Court case, that came out. It's called the Oneida v. Sherrill, and it deals with the Oneida Indian tribe in New York. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rest her soul, it marked her legacy as being anti-Indigenous because she wrote the opinion in that piece, which actually was against the Oneida tribe. And it was a land issue. The Oneida was trying to defend its treaty lands in the name of their treaties and their sovereignty. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had this famous line saying, "The embers of tribal sovereignty have long ago turned cold," meaning that these agreements no longer are valid in our modern society. And it was really a hard decision that Native people felt like they would never rebound back from, or it would take a long time to rebound from that kind of thinking. And that is why a decision like the McGirt decision that we saw last year, which restored treaty rights in a very celebratory way, and to admonish Ruth Bader Ginsburg's reputation, she ended up being the key swing vote, critical to vote in favor of that decision. So, I think that also adds to the symbolism of what that McGirt decision represents as well, is that we've come a long way, and that these treaty agreements, these historic documents, they aren't expired. They're very much a living and breathing part of our existence. And I think that as we go into a Deb Haaland Department of Interior, if and when she is confirmed, those treaty documents are going to become a little bit more of our modern day, everyday conversation. And I think that this kind of talk that we're having right now is just going to become more and more common in our everyday lexicon, I hope.
Yeah, it'll be more like Canada, where, this is a topic of discussion among politicians and journalists, as opposed to in the US, where it's largely just ignored. But I guess in talking about treaty rights, because, that's something that I think we've talked about a lot, and we talked about some of what that means, but I just want to go back to what you were saying about, healthcare and economic defense. So there are rights under some of these treaties signed between indigenous sovereign nations and the federal government that require the government to provide certain services, certain programs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, in the treaties, they weren't writing in the 1800s, we're going to create the Indian Health Services. That evolved, through the policies. But the treaties were the foundation under the protection plans that those treaties promised. Another thing that the treaties promised were protections at the hunting and fishing grounds of which tribal lands were situated. And sometimes those hunting and fishing grounds weren't always on the reservations proper that got parceled out to tribes, but they were seen as subsistence economies, right? So when we're talking even about economies in their very basic forms, non-monetary, for tribes, subsistence economies were their ways of survival. And so, these were the origins of a lot of the programs that we're seeing in the modern sense. The Indian Healthcare Service, right? That starts to become deeply rooted in a lot of the policies shaped around Indian child welfare separation with boarding schools. And they've just modernized themselves into this present sense where, unfortunately, they're pennies to the dollar that get funded. I think what we saw prior to COVID was that for every dollar that gets spent on the Indian Health Services, the federal government was paying in basically at 16 cents. So if that gives you a sense of how underfunded these programs are. Indian Health Services is probably the most chronic, but they're all chronically underfunded. There's just been, when you look at where wealth inequality lives, that's just one major example, obvious example, and an aspect. But another one, and I think this is more relative to a lot of slave, or rather Black inequality wealth, when we look at the inequality wealth gap involving African Americans. It's about the land and what kind of land was lost in the South, or at least property rights that were lost to the South, heirs property, and how the laws were basically rigged against Black homeowners who lost their properties, basically torn up or ripped beneath them from a lot of really shady local laws that were getting passed at the time to basically swindle Black homeowners out of their very precious lands. A lot of them that sit on, where country clubs now live. And so when you look at land itself as a derivative of wealth inequality, where the wealth gap originates, I mean, it doesn't get any more clear than that than in Indian country. And I don't think that there's been really the kind of hard scholarship that needs to be done in that space. You're starting to see a little bit, but it's because it's very complicated. I mean, the way that tribal trust lands have been so fractionated, they actually call it fractionated land, because as I'm even a recipient of fractionated land, when allotment happened, they did not, like the heirs property of that got changed. Like, there's no wills that get written that that wills land over to one family member to the next in Indian country. It's largely, if it's federal land, if it's federal trust land, it's largely parceled up by the federal government. It's and then it's divided among families, so that you could basically have a small parcel of tribal trust land that has been allotted to your family with dozens of owners that are part of that. And I certainly am an owner to a slice of some sort of tiny piece of acreage up in Turtle Mountain, where my father is from. And that you see that all across Indian country. And so land ownership is something that there's also just a major deficit.
So land ownership is parceled out by the federal government, not by tribal governments or institutions?
Say that again. What's the question?
So land ownership is parceled out by the federal government, not by tribal governments or institutions?
That's right. So like Alaska, let me go back up to Alaska. They're the only ones that really have what we call fee simple land. They own the land outright, although the way that they're structured under those complicated corporations. And so the way that they manage the land, what they do to the land in terms of a lot of mineral extraction, I mean, that was kind of the basis of making those fee simple lands. But here in the United States, they're what are called trust lands, held within the trust of the federal government, and they have been basically patriarchally dictated by the federal government to tribal nations and as allotments. That's what we saw in the 1880s play out, basically carving out, carving out pieces of land and divvying them up among people. And then there was this awful thing called surplus lands. And surplus lands basically was an easy excuse for settlers to basically take what wasn't given and reserved to Native Americans. And in those allotments to Native Americans, there just was no real thought to go into how those lands would be passed on to families. And so what has happened now, over a century later, is that you have these parcels of land that have just been divided up over the generations so that no one really owns the land. They're still tribal trust lands, but they're not owned by a family. Does that make sense?
Sure, but then where are people living on reservations? Do they not necessarily own the land that they're living on?
It's allotment land. So this is a really interesting personal story. We have an allotment plot on Laguna Pueblo, and there was some kind of 99-year lease that came up right around the time that my grandmother was dying. And somehow that paperwork did not get filled out. And that lease for that parcel of land adjacent to my grandmother's house got somehow kicked back in through the system of the BIA, where the regional BIA, where this land allotment plot came open. And because there's so little land plots on each reservation, all of a sudden, who had ever been waiting in line for a long time, because usually it's a long time, all of a sudden we had a new neighbor living on our family plot of land, which isn't that large. We had a new neighbor move their mobile home onto what otherwise had been a historic family plot of our family land. And we really didn't have a say in it. We had missed the deadline. We had missed the paperwork somehow. And there was nothing we could do about it because we didn't own the land. If we had signed the paperwork to secure it, we might have been able to prevent anyone else being there. That was the notion, but we didn't do that. And so today what you see is this historic property where you have my grandma's house and her two sisters' houses on the plot. And then this third party, I'll just say, living in this mobile home who we don't have any relationship to at all, other than that they're other tribal citizens, but we don't know who they are. Or we do now, but we didn't when they moved in.
And so there is a backlog of people who are trying to live on reservations?
People have been on list for decades trying to get land so that they can either move a mobile home in or, move some kind of house in. There's so little land, and then there's so many restrictions on where one can build. And then there's complications because it's not like it's all one connected piece of land. There's something called the checkerboard effect across these tribal trust lands. So that because of those surplus lands I was talking to you about, so if you have the plot, if you're looking at a puzzle and then you take off pieces of the puzzle, and then those little gaps of the puzzle, those little islands represent, non-native trust lands, basically some ranchers' farmland, right? You see that a lot in the Dakotas. You see that a lot on the Navajo Nation. You've got these checkerboard regions that aren't native. They aren't tribal trust lands. You don't have natives living on them. You have some white rancher living on there, but it's still, an island in the sea of an Indian reservation, basically. And that's all based on these wacky land laws that were happening, after in that allotment period between the 1880s and 1930s. And so what it does, my point is that it's complicated, like where the land is available even for someone to, if they wanted to move a house in, to live on. It's just very limited. And then if you have these 99-year leases, right, like the one that my grandmother had, chances are that they're being renewed and signed up for, I'm not really sure how long the leases are today, but these leases are intended to be generational.
And those are leases between the people living on the land and the BIA, the federal government.
That's right.
And so do the majority of people who are enrolled in tribes live on reservations, or because there's so little land, they have to live off the reservation?
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, there's so few options even if one wanted to live on their reservation. And then on top of that, they would have to be pretty self-sufficient because there's not a lot of jobs. There's not a lot of work to go around. And so, and for my Pueblo, and I think for a lot of tribal communities, you see roughly half of the tribal citizenry living on the reservation, and the other half scattered around, the world. Most often, a large population of every tribal community live near hub communities, border towns, or hub cities. So, like major cities like Phoenix, Albuquerque, Minneapolis, those are major native urban Indian cities, what we call urban Indian cities, because they center around a lot of Indian reservations in the Great Lakes in the Southwest. And that in large part is because of the need to migrate for economic reasons.
And then if you, even if you're an enrolled member of a tribal nation and you're living in a city, then you're not, you're like a citizen of the state, right?
Well, you never lose your tribal citizenship, right? I mean, even if you're not living on your reservation-based homelands, and remember, not all tribes have reservations. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, and there's only 324 Indian reservations in the United States. So that means that there's a percentage of tribes that don't have federal trust lands protected, right, as Indian reservations. And so, but that doesn't mean that they're not tribal citizens. That doesn't mean that these tribes don't operate tribal governments or have tribal offices. It just means that their geography is a little bit different and probably more embedded in municipalities, but they still function and have and exercise as sovereigns with the federal government, and are seen as sovereigns in the eyes of the federal government. So in that vein, like Native Americans, tribal citizens are essentially citizens of their nation, their tribal nation. They're citizens of their state of which they live in, and they're citizens of the United States. So they have this tri-citizenship. And, in that citizenry, particularly in border states. I mean, if you're going through, this is always a fun exercise for a lot of natives. They like to take their tribal citizenship card and use them in federal spaces, like at airports and at the borders, because they are seen as essentially the utilitarian federal IDs, and they should be respected as such in that citizenry.
And so even if you are not on a reservation, if you're an enrolled member of a nation, you have access to those treaty rights. You have access to the programs that those treaty rights guarantee. But
there's something like, I'm trying to remember how many urban Indian clinics there are. I think there's like a couple dozen urban Indian clinics across the United States, and they are designed to respond to the urban Indian population, those tribal citizens that have flocked to cities across the country simply because of, for economic survival reasons that, or other matters, to which they no longer live on their reservations, or for, whatever. People come to cities to go to school, like Albuquerque, they move to the city to go to school or for jobs or any other number of reasons, but that doesn't take away their tribal citizenry. And in fact, the Indian Health Services, for example, has built into that reality to respond to large urban populations.
But it does seem like it would be more difficult to exercise sort of judicial sovereignty if there is no reservation. Because the local police won't go onto the reservation, but if you're living in a city, even if you should not technically be subject to that jurisdiction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you're hitting at something that I'll just go back to healthcare as a really good example. So healthcare in Indian country has been urbanized. And let me just roll this back to remember I was telling you about that period between the 40s and the 60s where the federal government was trying to eliminate tribes in that era called Termination Well, at the same time, what they were doing is they were luring a lot of tribal citizens to urban cities. It actually had another name. It was called relocation. And in that period, there was an act. It was called the Relocation Act in 1954, I think. And it was, and in that act, it was intended to be seen as an economic development project that would take natives from the reservation and place them in some kind of trade school, and from those trade schools and urban cities, give them employment. Minneapolis is a relocation city for urban Indians, where I interviewed one who was was he the son or the son? He was the son of an air conditioner repairman who left the Red Lake Reservation for Minneapolis, went to trade school, and made his living as an air conditioner repairman in Minneapolis and raised his family off of it. And it's only recently that his son, is back on the reservation and doing economic development in a way that's more tribally sensitive. And I think that when you're looking at a city like Minneapolis, that's also a unique city, because there's this housing division. It's the only urban Indian housing division in the United States. It's called Little Earth. Some people call it the Urban Res, because it's the only housing program like it that you have to prove your tribal citizenry if you can live in that Section 8 housing. Very much like Section 8 housing that we see in Chicago or in New York, right? That kind of affordable housing. That's the only tribal housing program that exists in Minneapolis, largely out of the American Indian movement, who was demanding those kind of rights due to the housing shortages that were happening at the time in the 60s because of relocation. But you didn't see that take place anywhere else, not in Albuquerque, not in Phoenix, not in LA, not in San Francisco, all these cities that have large urban Indian populations. And in large part because the advocacy wasn't there. And I think at the time, you also saw that the federal government didn't see that they had trust obligations that didn't exist on trust lands. And so where you see that kind of trust responsibility living most in that relationship in urban centers is through healthcare. And so you have urban Indian health centers pretty much in some of the most populated urban cities where Native populations are largest, and Alaska being one of the most vibrant health systems. And I say vibrant, meaning the structure of which it runs has actually been written about a lot as one of the model programs of how universal healthcare can work here in the United States. So it gets, it's a model that I think hasn't been explored yet either.
But what's interesting about that, though, whether the Section 8 housing or the healthcare, is that would be accessible to anyone who is an enrolled member of any federally recognized tribe. So it doesn't seem like it is necessarily based on specific treaty rights in treaties between specific sovereign nations and the federal government, if it's open to just all, it seems like it's sort of that it's treating all enrolled Native Americans as being part of one sort of class, as opposed to being citizens of specific sovereign nations.
Yeah, so there are about 375 treaties that got ratified between that period, 1817 to 1871. But not every tribe signed treaties with the federal government. That doesn't mean that those treaty rights aren't extended to all of the sovereign nations with the relationship that it has and that trust relationship. So for instance, Laguna Pueblo, my tribe, we're not a treaty tribe, but that doesn't mean that we're excluded somehow from any of the other treaty protected programs linked to healthcare, housing, education, gaming. It's universal because that trust relationship of the federally recognized tribal system is universal. And so when you're looking at urban Indian healthcare, actually, it's imperfect in many ways because it has a kind of cap limit in terms of like who can access the certain services that are there. It's mostly based off of geography. So for instance, I live in Santa Fe. There's an Indian health hospital a few blocks from where I live, but I can't get certain services there because it's out of my coverage area. And it takes me through this another maze of jurisdiction in terms of the healthcare. If I want to go get my eyes checked, or if I want to go get my teeth checked, I have to find a way to get to Laguna, which is a transportation barrier for me because I don't own a car. I have to find a way to get to Laguna, which is a 3-hour drive or 2.5-hour drive, to get those services at our tribal clinic. And so it's imperfect in many ways. There's a lot of bureaucracy. And I think that, what you're saying is like, if it's available to every Native, that's partly true. Again, like the rest of Indian country, it's just not homogenous. And there's a lot of, differences and variances.
But in general, it's fair to say that there are certain BIA programs that are accessible and available to anyone who is an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe. And then talking about, I guess, especially reservations, that is a more sort of individual relationship that a tribal government would have with the federal government in terms of like what rights they would have on the reservation.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's different for every tribe, and every tribe is developing at a different stage. I mean, if you really look at the network of Indian country, we're independent little nations, right? We might have a lot of similarities. And certainly when you go region by region, the Native nationhood is going to be a lot more similar for those regions. All the 19 pueblos in the state of New Mexico have a lot of the same similarities versus, say, a lot of the Plains tribes for the Great Sioux Nation. They're dealing with their Native nationhood development at a very different pace. And so when you get into those different regions and when you really get on the ground and you start to see what they are, what those differences represent, that's when you really start to see how each tribe manages their nation building in different ways and their relationship with the federal government in different ways. And that comes across in every aspect, in every way: education, housing, jobs, crime. And I mean, the list just goes on. And building infrastructure. I mean, I think a big part of what we're seeing and what we'll see coming out of the Navajo Nation, certainly with all the attention they got out of in confronting the coronavirus, is the light that was shine on their infrastructure system regarding their water systems, their sewage, an issue that was not new. I mean, for Indian country, for Native people looking in, when we saw the surface of the lack of plumbing on the Navajo Nation and realizing the impact that had in dealing with the pandemic, these were not revelations for us, and they've come with understanding that in building infrastructure, it's not just building a house. If you wanted to solve the housing problem, you have to build the roads, you have to build the plumbing system for the house. I mean, it's building everything from the ground up. And I think that a lot of outsiders looking in don't realize that there's the real basic building blocks that still have to be addressed in a large part for a lot of our communities.
And again, just we talked about it a little bit earlier, but in terms of where the funding comes from, the federal government has some of these programs that it makes available to Indigenous people. And then does the federal government directly fund tribal governments do tribal governments, do they receive any tax revenue, or does it all come from, revenue sources like gaming or hunting or fishing or mineral rights?
Mm-hmm. I don't know of any tribes that are gaining anything from tax revenues directly, although there's a very interesting conversation in the aftermath of the McGirt decision, because of the empowerment that it's restored to the Muskogee Creek Nation over the jurisdiction. There's discussion now, very progressive, forward-thinking discussion about how tribes themselves could tax their own citizens, which isn't happening anywhere. And it's just a really unique and new and emerging concept to consider as ways for tribes to generate revenue for their communities. But those economic engines have been limited. As I mentioned before, I mean, the essential economies to tribes have been rooted in their subsistence economies to the earth and the land, right? I mean, there's subsistence economies to hunt and fish and farm and harvest on their lands. And so when that's been compromised and continues to be by, environmentally harmful projects, natural resource extraction projects, or even climate change itself and the impacts that climate change is wielding. I'm thinking of North Arctic communities who are dealing with coastal erosion at an alarming pace. We start to realize and see what where these economies can be uplifted and fulfilled, and looking at new ways of how to do that. And I think that's again what I had to say about Representative Holland coming in and looking at new ways to approach it. And I think that approaching this through a climate lens is also going to be very beneficial.
Yeah, because certainly, tribal nations are at risk from climate change.
Yes, there's a lot. There's a whole lot of discussion to have about that in terms of where tribes sit in that agenda and how that could really be a boost for tribal sovereignty. I think that, it's not an overgeneralization to see Native nations as the stewards of the land in many aspects. Today's Native advocates and leaders see themselves as guardians of these treaty rights that were signed with our ancestors, and the treaties that promised us healthy water and land. And that's what you're really seeing, in fights like the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's not just over an oil pipeline. It's over the promise that those lands, the water, was going to be protected and not threatened. And you can't fish in waters, right? That promise that you were always going to have healthy streams to fish in and hunt in and to survive off of. You can't do that if all of a sudden you have an oil spill that's going to contaminate it. And those kinds of arguments that are upholding treaties today, they're really starting to have a really interesting impact in the courts in ways that a lot of other climate justice arguments we've not seen being argued in these cases around courts. And so I think that's also going to be an interesting development.
And so, in general, are these reservations engaging in subsistence practices? Are people regularly hunting and fishing and farming?
They'd like to do more of that, but unfortunately, there's just this steady, there's always been a steady challenge to tribal hunting and fishing rights. We saw that in the 60s. There's this very explosive, very Standing-like-esque militarized response to Native people enforcing their treaty rights to hunt and fish in the Pacific Northwest. It was known as the Fish Wars, and it was a treaty stand, one of the first modern treaty stands that we saw. And I think it's emblematic of the kind of treaty stands that we're seeing around the pipelines, but also what's happening up in the North Arctic, as I mentioned the extraordinary number. There's something like 30 some odd villages, Alaska Native villages, that are facing coastal erosion due to rising sea levels. There was a case in Kivalina versus ExxonMobil that tried to challenge ExxonMobil as complicit and responsible for damages, so they could seek damages to move their village from their eroding island. And that failed, but I don't think that the fight is over, because the argument there, again, is that you can't have these treaty promises that, upheld the right to hunt and fish your indigenous homelands if you don't have healthy ecosystems to do that. Therefore, the treaty would be abrogated. And so I think that that's where the climate justice narrative becomes very critical and important as we look forward.
So it's almost 2 hours. I don't want to keep you all night, although I really enjoy talking to you. You're so obviously knowledgeable about all of this, and I think you're really doing a real service by explaining it to me, and I hope to my viewers. I think this is something that everyone in the United States needs to know more about, because indigenous communities and sovereign tribal nations are an integral part of the United States, and it's something that most people don't even know about, that these political entities exist, and that so much of, a good portion, not the majority, but a good portion of the citizenry in the United States is an enrolled member of a tribal nation. And this is a whole dimension of what the federal government does, and it impacts state and local environments and ecosystems, natural ecosystems, but also political ecosystems. So I think it's very important for everyone to understand, and I think it's particularly important for journalists to understand, because if you're reporting on issues and you live near a reservation, or you live near historically where a sovereign tribal nation, even if it doesn't have a geographic reservation, but where it resides, then these are issues that are going to come up. And so you should have background knowledge of what does it mean to be a tribal nation? What does it mean to be a member of a tribal nation? What are treaty rights? What are the BIA programs? And so I'm glad that you said this is information that's available on the Instagram account, Indigenously, right?
Yes, or you could just follow the newsletter. It's packed with all kinds of good details. Every week we drop a new edition every Friday. It's a Friday night newsletter meant for you to really just enjoy over the slow, steady weekend. And we pack it with a lot of stuff you're just not seeing in your newsfeed.
And so, yeah, I encourage everyone to subscribe to Jenny's newsletter, Indigenously. Go to indigenously.org to do that. But before we go, Jenny, in general, what do you think people, and especially journalists, need to keep in mind? Uh-oh, I think we lost Jenny. And let's see if she comes back. I think she'll come back. All right, we'll wait a little bit longer. In the meantime, go to indigenously.org and subscribe to Jenny's newsletter, particularly if you're a journalist in the United States. Because as I said, it is so important for people who live in the United States to understand the situation of indigenous people. And not just, I feel like there's a lot of media coverage of indigenous people that is, it's so tragic, their circumstances. but it's important to understand these political entities, these sovereign tribal nations. And that is why I've been so happy to talk to Jenny, and why I would encourage you to learn more about this and subscribe to her newsletter. Unfortunately, it looks like Jenny's connection has dropped, so she won't be able to close out the show. So I will just thank everyone for being here, for participating in the conversation. Michelle Alexander at Native Graffiti, thank you so much for your commentary and questions. Everyone else, I will be back with another episode of Sterne Look in 2 weeks. We're probably going to be moving to a every 2 week schedule instead of a weekly schedule due to the difficulty in booking guests every week. But thank you for watching the show. Remember to subscribe, join HAPS if you have not already, and I will see you in 2 weeks.